No. But I mean, I'm just the foot on the head, so don't listen to me.
Okay, so folks, everyone said bobcat on this one except for one. We had a house cat, and so so again, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll just point it out one more time. So here's the house cat tracks, and here's the bobcat. On this one, it is somewhat of a smaller bobcat. It's not a real big bobcat, and the toes are fairly round, so it's sort of in that. It's leaning more towards some of the house cat morphology that you would than like the perfect bobcat track. But just based on size alone, I looked at this right away and just like, oh, bobcat track. I didn't even think about it. I mean, in house cat tracks, here's a front of a house cat track. You tend to get that real wide arc of toes. The toes tend to be blockier, and then you know, on bobcats, the toes tend toward having a little bit more teardrop shape. There's variation on that based on the sex of the animal. If it's a male, they tend to be rounder. If it's a female, they tend to be more teardrop shaped. Oh, and then the thing about the hind foot having that big negative space, being a lot longer and narrower on the hind foot versus the front being rounder and so. Oh, and on the house cat, the hind track usually does not give you nearly as much of that negative space.
One thing that I'll add that's tricky with house cat tracks is that they're kind of like domestic dogs. They can look so different, you know? They can look, so the house cat tracks in there, I would say accurately represent a good average, but they can look really different than this. Like sometimes the toes are not quite stacked across the top. But I think one thing that I've tried to, you know, hammer home in my students is that I think that we automatically want to associate, since they're both cats, with them being the same. But if you really take a close look at them, they're not any more similar than like gray fox and house cat or gray fox and bobcat. Like they really do have really good distinctions between them. And it's helpful to try and separate them in your mind and not always combine when you see cat tracks going house cat, bobcat, you know, right away, and try and separate them out in your mind as completely different animals with completely different tracks that look similar, just like anything else would look similar.
Don't the house cats have more negative space?
Less negative space.
Yeah.
They typically have less negative
hind
space.
And so you can see it right here. See how there's not much space between these toes and the pad? There's just a little bit of white between there. And look at this one here. Look how much white is between there.
Oh, okay. I wrote it down, and now I remember writing less negative space.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like right here, the toes tend to be closer to the pad. So, so as far as which foot, house cats, and bobcats and mountain lions, and actually a lot of other animals too, share a lot of the same morphology with our own hands, right, and body. So if you put your hands down like this, imagine the thumb is not registering, it's higher up on your leg, then the longest toe is the middle finger, and that tends to be the case on these guys as well. And this one might be a little bit of a, well, no, it's not an exception, it still works. So so on this one here, this toe right here is extending a little bit further forward than the others. And if you're having a hard time seeing it, one trick I recommend is on your hand like this. It's easier to draw a line through these three fingers than it is through these. You see that? Like how that lines up more, and that doesn't line up. And on this one here, if I draw a line right here, those three toes, it lines up pretty well. These three, not quite as well. Does that make sense? And so when I looked at that, I just thought right front.
And I'll also see that palm pad pitch out a bit to the side of it.
Yeah, so if you draw a line, thank you. So if you draw a line under the bottom of the palm pad right there, it's drooping to the outside.
Oh, I gotta see out of here.
So here's the bobcat track right here. See how the pad kind of droops out to the outside? This is a right foot right here. So here you can draw the line through those three toes, not nearly as well through these three, and the pad is drooping to the outside right there. And so here's that kind of droop to the outside right there, and that's the longest toe. Yeah, so the line goes better through these three toes.
So it's a right front?
Yes. And so then as far as gait, it's hard to see the gait in here, right? You don't see everything right away. You get down here and you look and you say, okay, here's a nice front track, and then you look for the hind. I think it's right here, but it's pretty hard to see, and you might not have seen that. But up here you have another front and then the hind that show up easier, right? So you have front hind and then another front here, and the hind is pretty hard to see. It's probably up here somewhere.
It is.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you have a flashlight it can show up. So you have a front and a hind, front and a hind, front and a hind. It's groups of 2 tracks in a consistent pattern, right? So here's 2, same distance to here as it is to here, and it would continue on in those groups of 2. So is that a continuous or a broken pattern? It's a continuous pattern, right? And so that means you're either in the walk or trot category. One thing I'll say about walks and trots is if the animal is direct register walking, so the hind foot is landing on top of the hind foot, and you measure from where one foot touches the ground to where that same foot touches the ground again. So from here, that's the right front, the next right front is here. That would be hip to shoulder distance in a walk, and it would be longer in a trot. But remember what I said, if that foot if it's in a direct register trot, and is this a walk, right? Is this a direct register here? No, it's not. It's an overstep. And so when an animal starts overstepping, that distance gets spread out much longer, right? And so that hip to shoulder distance rule no longer works when it's overstep walking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what made me think it was a trot, because
of how long that distance was.
Right, and because they were more in line as opposed to be walking.
Mm-hmm. Well, so if a stride of this distance could be a trot, but the hind feet would be landing on top of the front feet. So that if it's overstepping, that would even be a much longer trot. Okay. And I actually don't know if I ever really see bobcats overstep trot.
But this is a trot.
No, this is a walk. This is just a
overstep walk.
If anyone said walk of any kind, then I'll accept that. Yeah, it's an overstep walk. It's just the most common pattern, most common gait bobcats use. Are folks good with that? Gaits can be tricky, but they're really, we'll probably ask more of them, so it's worth paying attention and asking questions if you have them.
I do on that.
Yeah,
that's a couple.
Great.
Because I went with trot.
Okay.
So when I'm looking at on the trail width, which seems pretty narrow, but also the distance between the front feet from this to this seemed pretty extended and beyond the range for Bobcat. When I walked it out, the walk made sense, and I actually had a harder time making the trot make sense of it. But so I don't know if you could speak to either of the
yeah, for sure. So I think it's the overstep is the issue. Is like when they start overstepping, they start stretching out a whole lot. They really extend their feet more than they normally do. And a raccoon is a good example of that. So when you have that 2 by 2 by 2 pattern, if you measure the distance from a right front to the next right front, it's like that far. It's like this super long stretched out distance, and it's because they're really extending into a massive overstep walk. I mean, that's what that is. That raccoon walk is just they're overstepping so much that this hind foot here is landing next to that next front there. And so when a bobcat is direct register walking, you're absolutely right. Its stride is going to be a lot shorter. And if this was a direct register right here, right? So if the hind is landing like right on top or right next to you, I'd be like, oh cool, it's trotting. But because it's in overstep, it's overstepping this much. So the way that works with animals is like I think of a direct register as like first gear, So it's more like the RPMs are real low on the car. You're just starting up, and for direct register walk, and then you start accelerating, and then that hind foot starts creeping up, right? And as the animal's going faster, that hind foot gets further and further and further forward, and then suddenly you shift into second gear, and bam, it starts over again, right? So the hind foot's right on top of that front and starts creeping up and up and up and up again. And so for this could totally be a direct register trot, but for it to be a overstep, you're talking high RPMs, into that second gear. So I think it'd be much more spread out. But I don't know. Does anyone else feel like? I mean, am I explaining that in a way that's working for folks? Or
When he said trail width, that's what confused me too.
yeah.
So I think with gaits and with anything with wildlife tracking, you really want to be looking at the master.
This is a tip, you know. If it's a furry vine, you just don't touch it.
Furry vines?
No, that's not good too.
It's pretty good.
There's like 4 different types of furry vines.
Yeah, just don't touch them.
Some of them are useful.
Well, I don't.
Anyway,
we don't have it where I
you
live
want to
in-
be trying to gather
I've never
clues,
seen it.
and sometimes some of your clues will take you in one way, and some of your clues will take you another way. But you want to try and take the preponderance of evidence into account when you're making a call. You know, so I think trail width for sure is something that leads a little bit more toward it being fairly narrow trail width, though I wouldn't say it's super narrow. Often a direct register or a trot often has almost a perfect line, you know, trail width. The body tends to move into a line like this, and I wouldn't say the trail width is, I mean, if you draw outside here and you come over to the outside over there, you know, you still have a pretty decent trail width, and bobcats tend to have a fairly narrow trail width anyway. But if you look at all the other evidence, the distance, the fact that it's overstepping, like there's way more in the realm of overstep walk.
And you know, this is one area where if people are curious, we could look at the measurements in Mark's book about like what his direct register walk, overstep walk, strides, and stuff like that are. I will say that there's a lot. I frequently find things that aren't within that realm, so I don't want to put like all our eggs in that basket. But it certainly could be.
Well, I think
could
that's
be helpful
challenging
for
too,
discussion.
because with animals that vary in size so much, it can be really challenging when you're looking at the smallest of the smallest that he's ever found and the largest of the largest he's ever found. You often find, like, you know, get into this real gray area of like, this is obviously not a very big bobcat, you know.
Right.
And so.
So yeah, because his gait is going to include the very longest walk, you know, stride for a walk that he's ever found from the biggest bobcat.
Yeah.
And this is a smaller one.
So I think those measurements can often be helpful to help you lean toward ruling out things on the extreme, but not necessarily things that fall in the middle. You know.
Right.
So if you're like, could this be, you know, direct register walk versus direct register trot, like that could probably be helpful in the, you know, but when you're looking at, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.